It was a whirlwind week for Canada and the Prime Minister on the world stage after his speech at Davos.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
While Trump was not explicitly named in that speech, you could definitely hear that that's who the Prime Minister was talking about, as well as the impacts of his tariffs, sparking Trump to fight back against Canada throughout the week and leading him to say this.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Trump then went on to rescind his invitation for Carney to join his Board of Peace for the Middle East and is now threatening 100% tariffs on Canada if it moves forward with a trade deal with China. This morning, I spoke to the Foreign Affairs Minister about the Prime Minister's speech and Trump's reaction. Minister Anita Anand joins me now. Nice to see you this morning. Thank you for coming in. There's lots happening. There's lots happening in your portfolio and around the world. I want to start with the comments made by President Trump yesterday on Truth Social. He said that Canada has voted in favor of doing business with China, who will eat them up within the first year. And yesterday he threatened 100% tariffs on Canada if it makes a deal with China. What did you make of those comments?
So, to be clear, Canada and the U.S. have had and will hopefully continue to have a long-standing trade relationship. $3.3 billion of trade in goods and services pass through the Canada-U.S. border every day. Mm-hmm. In addition, the trip to China was very much about resolving trade frictions and settling some specific issues. There is not a discussion about a free trade agreement with China. That's not the purpose of the visit. And I'm sure that we'll continue to diversify our trade relationships across the board, recognizing the importance of the Canada-U.S. economic relationship and at the same time not putting all of our eggs in one basket. Sure. China, India, Indonesia, the Gulf states, $71 billion UAE investment coming to Canada. Those are the types of trade diversification strategies we'll continue to embark on. And
I know you're not the trade minister, but you were on this big trip with the Prime Minister, and I'll talk more about his speech and other things. But the China portion of the trip that you also did, you know, there were concerns about how we manage that relationship with China from a security perspective. Are we giving up too much to China, allowing them to sell EVs in Canada and things like that? So how do you make sure that that isn't the case, that we're rebuilding the relationship but not going too far?
So from a diplomatic standpoint, my approach is to ensure that we are raising issues of concern to Canada at every step of the way, right, while also discussing the economic relationship. These are the times that we are in now. The geopolitical situation is shifting remarkably, and we need to meet the moment. And that means diplomacy, not walking away from the table, diplomacy, having the tough conversations, not hiding under a rock, discussing Canadian concerns from a human rights or public security standpoint, while at the same time ensuring that we're putting Canada's economic interests on the table. And so we do have guardrails, and from a public security standpoint, we ensure that we put the concerns of Canadians on the table. This is not easy diplomacy, Rosie. Diplomacy is not about hiding under a rock. It's about having those tough conversations and ensuring that the interests of the Canadian public are protected, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about the speech that got a lot of attention around the world, the Prime Minister's speech. It was about, yes, the old order not coming back, what the Prime Minister has talked about many times in this country, the rupture with the United States, and then the work of middle powers to stand up for what they need and what is right. What does that mean for Canada moving forward in your mind, like in a practical way, in a way that will, that Canadians can understand and will be able to see?
Well, I really think this is a key question because, as I have discussed with the Prime Minister, he has set the framework for much of what we will do in 2026 in terms of Canada being a middle power, but it now falls to the foreign minister and other ministers to implement, and that's exactly what we will do. As a middle power, what we seek to do is ensure that our interests are being met, and we do that with a group of countries on several issues already. Look at the Coalition of the Willing on Ukraine, look at the work that we do from a Five Eyes perspective. These are all groups of countries that are addressing pragmatically interests that we respectively hold. This will continue. And indeed, at Davos, I met with a group of countries that wanted to address Ukraine's energy needs in the face of illegal and unjustifiable Russian strikes at their electricity grid. These are the types of pragmatic steps that we will continue to take as middle powers and ensure we're meeting the moment.
Does it mean, though, that we are turning away from the United States? And I don't mean, obviously, geographically we're not, but from a security perspective, from a trade perspective, does it mean that we're realigning ourselves with other countries?
The plate tectonics have shifted in terms of trade, in terms of global alliances. And what Canada will continue to do is to group and gather with countries that have similar interests. Look at the Prime Minister's work across the board with India and Australia on information technology and data when we were at the G20. That was a coalition, if you will, that arose on an impromptu basis while the leaders were discussing the interests of our respective countries. And that is what this world requires as we see the multilateral relationships of the past number of decades since the end of the Second World War essentially shift in ways that we may not have expected, but in ways that we have to respond to pragmatically.
The president says he's disinvited or uninvited the Prime Minister from his Board of Peace for the Middle East. Do you know anything about why that happened or what the invitation was in the first place?
I've been studying the Board of Peace documents intensely, and I will say that I did not expect that we would be disinvited. At the same time, our policy in terms of the Middle East, in terms of assisting Gaza, will continue. What does that mean? That means that Hamas must disarm. That means that Hamas must have no role in the future governance of Palestine. That means that Canadian humanitarian aid will continue to be a top priority. $400 million on the table already for humanitarian aid for Gaza. These are key principles of our foreign policy vis-a-vis ensuring that the Israelis and the Palestinians can live in peace and security side by side for decades and decades and decades.
Is the threat against Greenland over now, from your perspective? Does it seem as though that has quieted? Because obviously that was what we were all dealing with at the beginning of last week.
Well, let's take a step back and think about the very fundamental perspective that Canada has vis-a-vis Denmark and Greenland, and that is that territorial integrity and state sovereignty are fundamental principles. I'm going to be traveling to Greenland next week, in fact, with the Governor General and our Arctic Ambassador, Virginia Mearns. We want and will continue to engage with both Denmark and Greenland in order to ensure that we're standing up for those principles. We're going to formally open a consulate, and let's just say that this is another example of states coming together to support another, this time in the NATO context.
I'll just end again on the president who in social media has gone back to the phrase governor, called the Prime Minister Governor of Canada, Governor Carney. I mean, the relationship now seems to have deteriorated to another level. Does that worry you? Should that worry Canadians that we're back to that point now?
The relationship has extended over decades and decades, and this will continue in terms of ensuring that we have a strong and vibrant economic relationship with our largest trading partner. I will be traveling to the United States, in fact, next week to engage with a group of countries on subjects relating to critical minerals. This is the work that we will continue to do with our largest trading partner. At the same time, we need to protect and empower the Canadian economy, and trade diversification is fundamental to that. That is why we went to China, that's why we will be going to India, and that is why we won't put all our eggs in one basket.
Okay, Minister, you have a very busy travel schedule. Thank you for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
NATO members breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief for now. Late last week, U.S. President Donald Trump walked back his threat to tariff multiple NATO allies that opposed his plans to annex Greenland, following news that a framework on a future deal was reached regarding U.S. involvement in the semi-autonomous territory.
What we discussed yesterday, it was a very good discussion, is how can we do that? One, how can collectively the NATO allies help here, the 7 in the High North, and also others to support that?
NATO Secretary General there, Mark Rutte, and U.S. President Donald Trump made an agreement just days after the U.S. and European allies exchanged threats of tariffs over the U.S. increasingly hostile rhetoric on Greenland. Though there have been few details, Trump has since claimed multiple times the U.S. will have total access to the territory based in NATO ally Denmark. With the global security order under strain, NATO's role is being tested on multiple fronts. Admiral Rob Bauer is the retired chair of the NATO Military Committee, and he joins me live. Nice to see you, Admiral.
Good morning, Rosie. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. So where do you think we're at now with the particular threat on Greenland? The president seems to think there's some sort of framework. It's very unclear to everyone else what that is, but where do you think that situation is right now?
I don't know all the details, Rosie, but I think we are in calmer waters now because of basically the role the NATO leadership played by convincing the U.S. president that it's not necessary for him to own Greenland in order to make sure that the measures that the U.S. and other NATO members need to take in the High North can take place. And I think that is the outcome. So I think it shows the great importance of NATO still, despite all the things that happened, because NATO is also for the U.S. too important to blow it up.
There was also, I think, a commitment from the EU to invest more in Greenland and to spend more on Arctic security. And so it did make me wonder whether the president sort of had a point, that needed to be taken more seriously and that Europe could do more.
Well, I've always said in every interview I gave about Greenland is that I fully understand the concerns of the United States when it comes to Greenland. If you look at Greenland from the North Pole map, then basically you see it's in between Russia and the United States. And therefore, in terms of security, it is an important piece of land. And with the waters of the Arctic now melting as a result of climate change, which is interesting, that we have a president in the U.S. that doesn't believe in that, but actually the consequences of the climate change now make it possible for the Russians and the Chinese to actually navigate those waters. And it's good for the merchant vessels, but if merchant vessels can do that, then also warships can do that. And that is a strategic threat for NATO if the Russians and or the Chinese can do that.
Were you concerned about whether the alliance was being tested again last week by the president? Because it was, I think there was real anxiety around what he was saying and what he was willing to do.
I was not really that worried because I think we have weathered more storms in the past where people tend to forget. I mean, the French left the military part of the alliance in 1966, returned in 2009. The Greek and the Turk fought each other in 1974 over Cyprus. So we have had the problems with Turkey and Sweden about the accession of Sweden. Yeah. So we have had storms in the past. We've changed, of course, our ways after the Cold War, and now back after the period of the wars of choice to wars of necessity, which is collective defense again. So all these things, we survived as an alliance because everybody understands how important and special this relationship is on the political and the military level. People talk to each other on a daily basis in the Brussels headquarters and in other commands about the security of North America, the North Atlantic Ocean, and Europe.
Those are all excellent examples of NATO being tested. But the U.S. is, I think, central to NATO's success. But maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps you would contest that. If the U.S. were to turn away from NATO or undercut NATO, would that not mean the end of NATO?
So, and what I agree with the Danish Prime Minister is when she said, if the U.S. would have attacked Greenland to take it militarily, that would have been the end of NATO. But because NATO is so important for the U.S. as well, despite everything you hear from the White House about the Europeans and the Canadians, I think it is a great thing to have 31 allies that are basically on your side in many, many issues. But it doesn't mean, however, that, of course, we do not have our differences. So you see this time and time again, that we test each other, that we put stress on the system. And therefore, it's so important that we have great leadership in the NATO headquarters at the moment with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General. And he was able to convince the US president to step away from the military action. But it doesn't mean that the importance of Greenland goes away with that. It is still an important issue for the Americans, and we will see what the outcome of the deal and the discussions is with the Kingdom of Denmark. But it will be something most likely in the reign of making sure that they have access whenever they want to do something militarily in terms to ensure the security of the alliance from the high north.
Could I get? I believe you were in Davos, but I'm not sure that you were at the Mark Carney's. I'm not sure you were at Mark Carney's speech, but I'm sure you've heard about it or read it now. I wonder what you made of his assessment of middle powers and where Canada needs to position itself in the world right now.
Now, I fully understand Canada's position with regard to the U.S., so I was not surprised there. And so, if you look at becoming less dependent on the U.S., that is a smart thing in many ways. At the same time, if you then make yourself too dependent, I'm not saying you are, but if Canada would make itself too dependent on China as the result of these tensions, then basically I think there's another issue and there's another challenge and there's another vulnerability for Canada entering into the equation. So I think it is about making sure that there is a balance with regard to your independence to anybody, and of course let's say the logical dependence on the U.S. for so long is no longer the case, and therefore you sometimes have to look at alternatives. But please be careful, Canada, if you make yourself too dependent now on China.
Admiral Rob Bauer, nice to see you again. I hope we can speak again. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.